So, I would have people come to me and they would say, "Oh, you're a memory researcher. You got to fix my memory. Why am I so forgetful?" And I say, "Well, I'm really forgetful too. My memory is terrible. But if my memory is terrible, your memory is terrible, everybody's memory is terrible, maybe none of our memories are terrible. Maybe the system is working as it's supposed to. And maybe remembering is not about memorizing everything. And the idea is that our brains aren't trying to pack everything that we experience for the future. Our brains are trying to estimate what we'll need and packing that and nothing else. So our brains like to pack light, and that serves us well for the most part.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today, we're going to be getting up to date on the most recent research into memory. We're going to be getting into how we store memory, the different types of memory, the way we actively construct it rather than just receiving it, its importance to our sense of self and framing of the world, to our attention and motivation, to our openness and updating of our beliefs, and to deja vu. We're also going to be getting into the influence of screen time and multitasking on memory, some unexpected lifestyle factors that influence the quality of memory function and how that can feed into memory disorders. And we're also going to be looking into traumatic memories and how we can reframe them and the psychedelic research on that too. Fortunately, to navigate this ocean of interrelated topics, we have one of the world's most fun and knowledgeable authorities on memory, psychologist, neuroscientist, and head of the Dynamic Memory Lab at the University of California, Davis, Dr. Charan Ranganath. He's the author of over 120 scientific papers on memory and has recently released a fascinating book for the general public on all of this, Why We Remember. And it's packed full of fun and interesting data and stories. Charan is also a rock guitarist with several bands, so he's a man of many, many talents. Now, I have been keen to do an episode on memory ever since realizing that the distribution of memory throughout our neural networks and out beyond into previous generations and the collective memory of our species at large is anything but an arbitrary record of the past. So I simply can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Charan Ranganath, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. How are you today?
I'm great. Happy to be talking to you this morning.
Well, it's very good of you to come on. I really, really appreciate it, Charan. So I love to start by asking my guests about their earliest deep conscious reflections about life, about the universe and existence, usually sometime from sort of 8 onwards, but could be earlier. Can you remember anything from that time that hits you particularly hard when you look back?
Well, I mean, you always have to be a little suspect of memories from, that early period. I guess probably my first life memory, which again isn't necessarily something that I remember from that experience, was I was probably 3 years old. So again, don't expect it to be reliable, but I know that I had fallen out of my crib and broke my arm. And what I remember was that, I was very hyper. And so like my, I would walk around with my parents and, I think like I was in a stroller or something. I can't remember for sure, but we lived in Texas at the time, and people there were so like moved by seeing this kid with a broken arm that they would give my parents money and say, please buy him something.
Oh my
So it was very sweet.
And what about your first sort of, shall we say, philosophical or conscious memories, memories about big questions? Does anything jump out because it may have affected what you ended up going on to research?
I think that I was remarkably flat, sort of philosophically, until college. And
Mm,
college is where things changed because I grew up in the 80s, and I didn't really, my dad was an engineer and very much expected me to follow in his footsteps as an engineer. And I was always good at math, but just kind of alienated from most of what was going on. And so I went to college, and that was the first time I was really challenged to the point where I was really struggling in classes, like ever. And so I just really sort of faded out of engineering and found myself sort of floating and asking myself, okay, what do I want to do? And it was the first time I thought, well, maybe the meaning of life isn't to make as much money as possible or whatever, but rather to, and I think around that time, that was probably the time where my dad, who had been working for General Electric for a long, long time, had gotten let go because of some issues where they basically put the blame on him for something that happened at the company. And so it worked out great for him in the end. He was able to start his own business. But that plus all the stuff that was going on with the recession at the time really sort of soured me on the whole idea of, you know, working for the man. I never really liked that idea anyway. So it really kind of gave me a sense of like, what's the meaning of everything? And it was kind of the first time I started to look at myself and say, like, hey, not everything's working properly. And so I got into psychology, and psychology was really interesting for me because number one, I was able to see this world of like, people who struggle with things. And it's not a matter of like, we're always supposed to be happy all the time, and that there's a lot of people who experience a lot of different kinds of, real issues. And then the second thing was I was volunteering in a lab, and they basically were paying me to do programming, which is what I was supposed to be doing as in my engineering major. But this time I was just doing it all myself, and it was great. And I kind of realized that I like being in labs and doing research as opposed to doing engineering or solving other people's problems. And so it was one of those things where I don't know that I was really fully deeply thinking about it at the time, but I was sort of discovering what do I like as opposed to what am I supposed to do.
Mm.
And that was really, I think, where things kind of got going in my direction.
Okay. So, Charan, let's get straight into today's topic, which is your new perspective on memory. So, in this new book, Why We Remember, and in your work in general, it really challenges this idea that memory is simply a record of the past. And a big part of this new perspective is a massive switch in neuroscience in general over the last 10 to 15 years that really struck me for the first time when I was in conversation with British neuroscientist Anil Seth, that the human brain builds up a view of the world from the inside out, based on our needs and our cultural concepts and our biases, as much as from the outside in via our perception. And so, in a similar way, with memory, you draw this distinction between the experiencing self and the memory that we then form about those experiences. How does this work, and why does this shift of perspective change the way cognitive scientists have traditionally seen memory?
Well, it's interesting. So this distinction between the remembering self and experiencing self was actually made by Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on decision making. And I took a class with Danny when I was an undergrad, and it was hugely influential on me in terms of just thinking about the fact that people's decisions aren't necessarily rational. But he didn't really bring up that distinction until I had read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And as a memory researcher, this really struck me because we in the field of memory have known since Ebbinghaus's first studies in 1885 that people's memory is extraordinarily incomplete, meaning that, he would study himself and try to memorize these meaningless words and would find that the overwhelming majority of what he had tried to memorize, like about 70%, was gone within 24 hours. In fact, a lot of that forgetting happens within the first 2 hours. So it really struck me at some point how much the research that I and others have been doing was predicated on this assumption that we're supposed to remember everything, even though every memory researcher in the world knows that we forget lots and lots of stuff and that people aren't very good at memorizing. So, I would have people come to me and they would say, "Oh, you're a memory researcher. You got to fix my memory. Why am I so forgetful?" And I say, "Well, I'm really forgetful too. My memory is terrible. But if my memory is terrible, your memory is terrible, everybody's memory is terrible, maybe none of our memories are terrible. Maybe the system is working as it's supposed to. And maybe remembering is not about memorizing everything. Maybe it's about actually doing something different, right?" And the analogy I like to give is, let's say I'm going on a trip, right? I don't take everything I own, like I don't take all this stack of amplifiers I have and synthesizers and guitars and, telephones and everything that I own and try to take it with me on a trip, right? I try to figure out, okay, what do I think I'll need? Well, I'll need this much underwear. I'll need this many socks, and so forth. And I pack based on what I think I'll need. A week later, I'm wherever I'm supposed to be. And sometimes I forgot things. I didn't pack exactly what I needed. Sometimes I packed too much and I packed things that I didn't need. But on average, I do pretty well. And I think that's a metaphor for the journey of life that we all have to take. And the idea is that our brains aren't trying to pack everything that we experience for the future. Our brains are trying to estimate what we'll need and packing that and nothing else. So our brains like to pack light, and that serves us well for the most part. You can look at people who have what's called severely deficient autobiographical memory. And these are people who can't tell you about much about what they've done 2 days ago. And even when they describe something that happened the same day, it's almost like as if they're reading a story from a book. They don't seem to have this re-experiencing of memory. And yet they're happy, they're successful, they're fine. You can look at people who have highly superior autobiographical memory. So these are people who remember every detail from some event that happened 4 years ago. And yet they're, if anything, a little less happy. They're often prone to ruminate. They're often um, find that they're plagued by negative memories and so forth. And they're definitely no more happy or successful than the regular average person on the street. So the idea that we're supposed to remember everything and somehow that's good, it just doesn't make any sense. And that was something I wanted to convey in the book. And again, it's not to say that, we shouldn't remember things. It's just that we should look not at remembering more, but at remembering better.
So in that sense, we remember only particular things based on what's important to us. So sometimes called what's salient. And those that we pay attention to with a genuine interest and genuine curiosity. And so this idea of selective memory, often leveled at us as a criticism, is actually the brain doing a great job of prioritizing what's actually going to be important and necessary in the future.
That's right. That's exactly right. And, some of our research has really pointed to this idea that if something is utterly predictable, we don't seem to form episodic memories for those experiences. Or when we do, they're very spartan and, blurry. And the reason is because we already knew what was happening before we did it. So there's not much of a reason to encode much of a memory. And so our memories, at least episodic memories or memories for events, they tend to emphasize the stuff that's surprising, the stuff that's new, or the stuff that's emotionally significant. It's like as if we use episodic memory to fill in the blanks for what we couldn't predict based on our knowledge.
And so that emotional thing, particularly, I guess, things which are dangerous with the
Mhm.
negativity bias, that emotional component in some sense makes it more impressive in the memory.
That's right. That's right. So if you think about our emotions, these are conscious experiences. So Anil Seth, I'm sure, talked a lot about this, but these are conscious experiences, but they're linked to motivational systems in the brain, right? So when you're feeling desire, that's associated with motivational systems in the brain that release dopamine. When we're feeling under threat, where it's associated, when we're feeling scared, it's often associated with these threat related systems in the brain that release noradrenaline. When we're feeling attachment, that's associated with these motivational systems that release serotonin. And it's not to say these chemicals do one thing or another, or they cause emotions per se, but they're all related to these experiences we have. And all of these chemicals I described are what's called neuromodulators. They don't make the brain more active per se. In fact, sometimes they reduce activity, but they tend to change the way we pay attention, and they change memory. They enhance plasticity. They encourage the new connections that happen during an event to really solidify and become resistant to interference and competition. So that's why when we look back, it's a lot easier to remember the emotionally significant experiences in our life than the ones that were more mundane.
Okay, and that's something we're going to be coming back into a bit of detail in a moment, listeners. And this leads us to this beautiful system by which the memory anticipates and predicts what will be important in the future by associating the retrieval cues or the prompts to the important experiences in the present. That way, future experiences can prompt a retrieval of those memories, making us feel familiarity with that experience and therefore guide us in this future response. And this is basically how we learn, right, Charan?
Mhm.
And we might not even necessarily need to consciously reason about it, which is another really important point, because maybe we don't have time, like in a threat situation, when the amygdala is activated, we're acting long before we've had time to think about it. So we're really relying on that past memory. Can you explain this associative cue system, Charan, and its relationship to learning? Maybe give us one of your great stories to help demonstrate.
Well, let's see here. So I'll first explain, and then we'll see if a story comes to mind. But
Right.
what we believe is that retrieving a memory is like you have to find the right key for a particular lock, so to speak, right? So you've got like a bunch of neurons that were active during a particular event. And in theory, to retrieve that event, you need some of those neurons to be activated again. And then the brain can start to complete that pattern and help you pull up the whole memory and kind of jog the system into place to pulling you back in time. One example I talk about in my book is how I would travel to India as a child. And, we would go about once every 4 years. So not very often. We'd spend about 2 or 3 weeks there. My parents would take me, and what I would find is that when I would get off the plane, so we would typically fly into Madras, which is now called Chennai, and there is nothing in the United States that comes close to resembling that area. I mean, maybe Hawaii a little bit, but the humidity, the heat, the sounds, the colors, the smells, it's an intense context that's unlike anything that I'll find in my daily life here. And when I was in that context, memories really just came back to me of other times that I was there. Sometimes it was a full blown remembering. Sometimes it was a feeling of remembering and an ease of pulling up memories for things that happened in that context. So it's not that I had forgotten all that information, it was there. But until I had that context surrounding me, until I was immersed in that context, I couldn't pull that stuff out. And that's because of a brain area called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is specifically important for episodic memory. So it's not, when we talk about the knowledge that we have about the world, like rattle off a bunch of facts about India, not so necessary for that. We can get into that a little bit more. But remembering a particular experience that happened only once when I was in India, that is something where you need the hippocampus for. And the hippocampus is triggered by being in particular places or reminders of particular times. Because in some ways, the hippocampus is a very dumb brain area. It doesn't really allow us to understand events as much as it's just blindly associating things that just happen to go together by pure coincidence in space and time. And so when you're cued by some kind of reminder of the place and time, like the smell of, intense incense or the particular flowers or the sound of the birds that you hear in the distance, and like, again, that humidity that's so intense, it really brings back unique moments in your life, right? And the same is true. You listen to a song on the radio, and a song on the radio that you haven't heard in 20 years can bring you back into that place and time. And so, because episodic memory is so linked to space and time, the psychologist Endel Tolving, who came up with the concept of episodic memory, used to talk about it as mental time travel. The idea that retrieving a past memory can literally take you back in time. And so we talk about how recalling different events literally would be like traveling back and forward in time, just like in that movie Back to the Future.
And I actually talked about this with my students. I'm a language teacher when I'm not acting, and the uh, the power of association techniques to memorize. If I believe, I think memory athletes tend to use
Mhm.
association mostly as the strongest technique. And it is remarkable if you can associate sight with sound, with muscle memory, you can remember almost anything. And I think it's something that can be trained. It can be trained, this ability, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, so what's fascinating is if you look at the strategies of memory athletes, they're not, they're they're actually remembering more by memorizing less. And what I mean by that is, if I were to show you a massive deck of cards and I say, memorize all these cards in order, and you have, let's say 1 minute to go through all the cards and remember them in order. Most of us would be overwhelmed because we're trying to go through each card and try to put it all into memory. And there's like, whatever, 52 cards in a deck or something. You're trying to memorize all of them, right? And what a memory athlete does is they've already memorized names for each card that are kind of like quick indexes. And then they make up a story that meaningfully links all of these cards together in the right order. And so they take this massive amount of information and they reduce it into a simple story, right?
But that's another interesting point there. Isn't it? It seems to be true that people remember stories about things much better than they do data itself. We seem to be prone towards individual stories. So it's much better in our job of teaching science, for example, or teaching analytic, data-led subjects. Actually, you're much better off creating a story about an individual in that data than you are about the data itself. What's going on there?
Well, we have common patterns for events in our head called schemas. And so, for instance, if I were to tell you, hey, look, I'm going to go to, let's try to give me a good kind of event that you would go to. I'll make this relevant to
I'm a
you.
big music guy as well. I'm a DJ and a festival programmer. So give us a rock reference, man.
All right, yeah, yeah. So let's say I'm going to a concert, right? And I know it's going to be in a stadium. Before I even go, I will have a very clear idea of what is likely to happen. If it's in a stadium, there's probably going to be like, issues with parking. I'll have to get, maybe searched at the door. I'm going to pay too much for the ticket because all these corporations rip you off, and there's going to be like a merch stand where everything's overpriced, all these things, right? And so I have that memory in place just from a few experiences of going to stadium concerts. I don't normally see concerts. I like to go to clubs, but even from just a few experiences, you can build up that schema in your head, and the schema is so rich. It's like I have a scaffold in place for the memory before it even happens, right? And so it's kind of like the example I give is if you go to a suburb, and I realize this isn't as applicable in the UK, but in California, there's all these housing tracts that were built basically overnight after World War II. And you go into these areas, and basically one out of every three houses has the same floor plan. And so as a result, it's like you can have houses that look different on the outside, but you walk in, so when I lived in one, we would go to our neighbor next door, and the outside of the house looked very different. The roof was different, the paint was different. But when I walked in the first time, I knew exactly where the bathroom was. And so that's how schemas tend to work. It's a floor plan, a blueprint, so to speak, for different kinds of memories that we can form. And so then once we have those blueprints in our head, it's we're reducing the amount of information that we need to encode when we're forming episodic memories.
But that's
So
presumably be an issue when we come to prejudice and biases, right?
that's exactly right. So the schemas that we have for events are pretty straightforward, but we can also build knowledge about people and build knowledge about different kinds of people. And those can lead to stereotyping, right? So sometimes from our, random experiences, but often from things we hear and read, you build up these knowledge structures that have inherent biases in them. And of course, for social psychologists, they can get into the whole thing about in groups and out groups and so forth. But just from the perspective of memory, what we know is that certain patterns will become easier to encode because we have a schema. But not just that, when we remember an event, we'll be biased to reconstruct that event based on the schemas that we have. And so, to the extent that we have stereotypes and biases about different kinds of people, for instance, we might be more likely to, that are negative, let's say, we might be more likely to remember negative events associated with the people from that group. And we might reconstruct those memories in a way that's more negative and tend to overlook the information that contradicts the stereotype. I mean, in general, when we remember, we have a confirmation bias where we remember events in a way that confirms what we believed going into it. And that's partly because we have these scaffolds in place in our memory. And so, but what I like to tell people is it's super important to understand that remembering is not an act of replaying the past. It's an act of imagination. It's really remembering how the past could have been. And what's been fascinating in the past 20 years is there's been this resurgence. And I say a resurgence because Frederick Bartlett talked about this in the 1930s. But there's been this new resurgence in the idea that episodic memory is not only about imagining the past, but that we use episodic memory to imagine the future. And our own work suggests that we use episodic memory to fill in the blanks and imagine the present. And so we're constantly traveling back and forward through time. And there's this brain network called the default network that seems to be critical for this process. And we've played a part in identifying different subnetworks within the default network, but it allows us to create this internal model of how the past could have been, but it also allows us to create these models of how the future could be. And so if you scan people's brains while they're imagining something that never happened versus scanning people's brains while they recall something that did happen, you could show an expert the activation maps in the brain, and they would be hard pressed to tell you which is which. It's that similar. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that the brain is doing exactly the same thing. We have the ability to tell the difference on average between things that have happened and things that haven't happened. But there's a remarkable degree of overlap.
Mm. So, with that psychological background, let's just spend a bit of time on the nuts and bolts of how this works in the brain and the body. Let's look at the interaction between the various regions of the brain. So, you mentioned the hippocampus. So,
Mhm.
we know that the hippocampus is very important because those with damage to that region experience radical memory loss. We also know that the frontal cortex is crucial too, and that's a particular interest to your lab, Charan, because of its
Mhm.
involvement in attention and motivation, which we're about to get into with relation to dopamine and serotonin. But as so often in neuroscience, it is the global interaction that distributed all across all of the neurons of the brain that permits memory to do its job. Can you tell us the story, or at least an attempt to tell the story simply, of the various parts of the brain and the various neuromodulators that come together in concert in some way to sort of facilitate this psychology you just described?
Well, if I could do it confidently, I would probably get a Nobel Prize for this, right? I mean, this is the holy grail. But part of where my research is really going is to try to create a language for how to even talk about these interactions, because so much of neuroscience has been bogged down in this kind of old school view that the hippocampus does this and then the prefrontal cortex does this. And it's this very serial kind of process of one area does some computation and then hands it off to another. And that's an artifact of the way we study things because like it's a limitation to the methods that we have, and the methods that we use will limit the kinds of questions we can ask and the kinds of answers we can get. And to be fair, there's also technological limitations. So for a long time people were recording from individual neurons in animals and making inferences about what the brain does. Now people are using calcium imaging and people are using neuropixels to harvest activity from massive populations of neurons. And the whole way people think about neural coding in a particular brain region has changed as a result. And I think where we're going, where I've been really trying to push the field of memory to go in, is to think about broad brain-based networks. And one of the things that we find is that the interactions are very dynamic. It's not like, 10 areas just constantly working together over time. There's constant changes that are taking place in these interactions, but it's scaffolded in a particular way. So you can imagine it's like we have a particular set of tracks that you could run on, but within those tracks, the train might go only, between certain destinations at certain times, right? And that's kind of how we think the brain works. We've got some computational models to look at this. And so what if I were to give you my best story for this, right? Um, we have a model and we have a model along these lines, but my best story would be something along the lines of we start talking. I use the schemas that I have to build along with my ability to pull back information from past contexts that are similar to create a little internal model in my head. Like imagine I can create a little script in my head for how this conversation could play out. And I use that internal model, and that seems to depend on the default network to basically predict where things are going to go. Now, at some point, my model falls apart and I won't be able to predict where things are going to go. But I mean, just to give you an idea, I mean, we've all been to parties, for instance, where there's lots of noise and you're trying to talk to somebody. And despite the fact that you're probably not hearing one out of three words that they're saying, you can often have quite a meaningful conversation because so much of that conversation is not me hearing your words and translating them as much as me coming up with a model of what I think you're trying to communicate and just matching up the words to that model and seeing how well we're doing, right? So now you have these points where there's some kind of my model fails, and all of a sudden you surprise me with the question that I wasn't expecting. Well, what we find is these are the moments where the hippocampus seems to preferentially talk to the default network to encode episodic memories. And so in a model, what we think it's doing is it's saying, okay, well, here's all these particular neurons that are active at this moment. And we're gluing in connections between those neurons and the hippocampus so that later on, when I'm trying to remember this event, I'll preferentially remember the points that were the most unpredictable, the points where the rest of my brain, like the default network, were really struggling. Now, where the prefrontal cortex comes in is it's allowing you to focus memory processing on your goals. So, for instance, if we're having this conversation, there might be a whole lot of other stuff going on around me. My dog might be barking, there might be a garbage truck outside or something. But the prefrontal cortex allows us to say, hey, given what my goal is, which is to communicate with you, I'm going to tune out all that other information. But it's also important for being able to search for information in memory. And so later on, if I'm trying to reconstruct this context and try to pull up the right information, the prefrontal cortex can play this role in focusing the brain and helping to generate the right cues to be able to pull up the right memory as opposed to a random memory. And so you can see, for instance, when we get older, maybe not you, but for me as I get older, the big challenge is that I struggle to remember often because I'm very distractible while things are happening. And then later on, it just takes a lot more work for me to generate the right retrieval cues and to be able to reconstruct the context of the past. And that's related to the fact that the functioning of the prefrontal cortex goes down.
Mm.
The last bit in this is you mentioned neuromodulators, and we think, and there's some evidence to support this idea, that at those moments of high prediction error, which we call event boundaries, that there may be a burst of activity in neuromodulatory regions of the brain, like areas that process dopamine and maybe noradrenaline, that will enhance memory encoding at those times. Now,
Because we failed to predict it. Therefore, that's the brain telling us this is going to be important because you got it wrong.
that's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. And one of the things that we found, interestingly enough, is when that interaction takes place at the wrong time, like in the middle of an event, which is highly predictable, people have worse memory for the event. But when that interaction happens at the moment where most people will say, okay, this is an unpredictable moment, that's when people have better memory for an event. So again, it's not about just having these areas talk to each other, but having the areas talk to each other at the right time.
Mm.
And if you think about it, even though it seems counterintuitive, you can make sense of it because if the hippocampus encodes too many memories, what can happen is you end up with clutter, right? So if you have just the right memories for the right points in time, you're going to be able to pull up the information you need when you need it. But if I start encoding random memories at random times, well, now I've got a bunch of disconnected memories for the same event, and they can actually compete with each other. Just like if I had a whole lot of, post-it notes on my desk that are all the same color, and I'm looking for one particular password that I wrote down, it's going to be really hard. But if I'm very selective about, putting a post-it note only for something that's super important, it's a lot easier to find what I'm looking for.
Mm.
And so that's part of the new story of memory that's emerging is how much memory is emphasizing the unpredictable, the surprising elements, the novel elements.
Okay, so let's just zoom in on attention and
Hmm.
dopamine you just mentioned. So
Hmm.
dopamine is obviously famous for its role in motivation, not only in terms of anticipating the reward that comes, but even the everyday activation of the body to just move and do stuff.
Yeah.
But regarding memory, it's relevant because it drives our interest and our curiosity, which in turn
Hmm.
drives the attention to things that seem to matter for the future. Charan, can you just help us to understand how curiosity is fundamental to the healthy formation of memory in this dopamine context?
That was one of the most exciting pieces of work we actually did. And I have to totally credit Matthias Gruber, who's actually a faculty member at Cardiff University in Wales. And Matthias was a postdoc in my lab, but he had done his graduate work at University College London. And so he would like to go to these pub quizzes sometimes. And, the pub quiz, people become addicted to this because they love the idea of getting this question and being able to know the answer. But sometimes what happens, for any of us who've been at a pub quiz, if you're not a trivia superstar, you get a question and you don't know the answer. So what happens? Do you find you just wait till the answer comes up? Well, sometimes you really have a burning curiosity and you can't wait to find the answer. And so Matthias thought this should influence memory. And we already knew at the time that when people are anticipating a reward, there's an activation of the dopaminergic system in the brain, and you get an enhancement of memory that's related to this activation. So it's as if the brain's prioritizing memories for information that's associated with reward. And Matthias had seen a study that indicated that maybe the same thing happens when we're just curious. And the logic was that, in fact, like if dopamine may be released preferentially when you're being energized to seek out a reward. And curiosity is effectively the seeking out of information. And so what we did in this experiment was he generated many, many, many trivia questions, and we screened people ahead of time to find out which questions they knew the answers to and which ones they didn't. And for the ones they didn't, we would say, how curious are you to find the answer? So then people are lying in an MRI scanner and they see a question, and we just ask them, how curious are you to find the answer again? And what we find is when people, and then we make them wait, and then they get the answer to the trivia question. So the whole reward story of dopamine would suggest that, well, to the extent that it's rewarding to learn the answer, you should get a big burst of activity when people get the answer. But what we found was, in fact, it was triggered by the question, that it wasn't about getting the answer, it was about the drive to find out the answer. And so we would see the more curious people were, you could actually fit a line to it. The more curious they were, the more activation we would see in these dopamine processing areas of the brain, like the ventral tegmental area and the ventral striatum, for those who are more technical in your audience. And so what it was suggesting is that, again, curiosity is not necessarily a happy, state. It's more of a state of mild discomfort that energizes you to satisfy that itch. But the other cool thing about it was we did find that people remembered the answers to these questions if they're more curious. And I remember there was an article about this in The Guardian, and one of the commenters, which of course you remember all the negative comments on these things, and somebody said, well, my grand could have told you this, right? And so, but the interesting thing was that it wasn't just that people were better at remembering the answers to questions that they wanted to find the answer to, but we would show people a random face while they're in suspense and waiting for the answer. And the more curious they were, the more likely it was that they would form a memory, successfully encode a memory for that face. So being in a state of high curiosity promoted memory for the face. And we found this really interesting interaction that the people who showed more of a benefit in curiosity on memory also showed more hippocampal activity at the moment that they see this face. So the story seems to be, when we are in a state of curiosity, our brain is energized to, our brain energizes us, I should say, to get information to satisfy that curiosity. And in that process, we're very plastic. And so I think this is really profound because, I, for instance, really get bored very easily and I really crave new experiences. And novelty is another kind of situation, like you walk out of a train station into a European city you've never been before. And there's this rush that you get. And sometimes it can be a little uncomfortable because you're like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? But you have this drive to explore and just see everything and meet people. And so for me, that is a very kind of, I feel it very personally. And so we were able to simulate this in the lab with fairly trivial stimuli, I mean, literally trivial stimulator, right?
Right.
Yeah, but in real life, it's, we have much bigger things that we're curious about, whether it's like, I'm a big fan of the TV show Severance, and at the end of every episode, I can't wait to see the next episode, right?
Power of the unknown. I think the power of the unknown really, particularly in science, is just really drives people to do often very banal and long-winded research projects just out of this desperate curiosity.
And what's
Very.
interesting about it too is that it's something that we can cultivate, because part of what we find, I mean, there's a personality variable called openness to experience that seems to be correlated with curiosity. And in fact, if you look at the definitions of openness, it almost is a definition of being curious.
Well, that's what I wanted
But
to ask about next, about this connection between neuroplasticity and mental flexibility in learning, because we see young people have this extremely high plasticity, which seems to go with a kind of flexibility of their minds are influenceable. They're more open to new information, not necessarily because they believe it or they're going to take that on board, but they've just got more room for that flexibility. And we see that as neuroplasticity decreases with age, we get this kind of mental rigidity, and it seems that that's connected to memory dysfunction. What's the relationship between neuroplasticity and this mental flexibility so important for learning?
Well, I think that there's a couple of different things going on. So one is everybody tends to learn better through active learning, the act of, kind of going out into the world and exploring as opposed to just passively being asked to memorize something. And children naturally learn from play. And if you look just, any society, I'm sure you'll find children play and they learn from their peers. I remember when my daughter went into daycare, her knowledge about the world just exploded, through playing with other kids and interacting with them and being with other, adults, so forth. So that period of time, though, is also, as you mentioned, a very high period of plasticity. And it's especially a high period of plasticity in the neocortex, which is basically the big mass of tissue that you see when you look at the outside of a brain. And so that's part of why during that period of time, we can form, we can really learn languages and acquire a native accent in those languages. Now, throughout the rest of adulthood, we have gobs of plasticity, and even people in their 80s have plasticity. It's just in the cortex, it's much, much slower. But it's not like you can't learn when you're in your 80s. You can, it's just harder, it's slower. But I think some of the rigidity comes from both. I think there's a bunch of factors, but one is, and I talk about this at the end of my book, is I came to appreciate kind of this sort of stage of life theory of memory. So the standard story that we tend to get in memory research is kids have bad episodic memory, which is kind of ironic. Young adults have great episodic memory, and then old people have terrible episodic memory. But the way I see it, early in life, children are learning through play and exploration. They have memory, but it's not necessarily tied to any particular kind of focus. And so there are other factors. The child's sense of self and so forth plays a role too in episodic memory. But when you're an adult, our brains are optimized for goal focus. Our prefrontal cortex has developed connections that are appropriate for the cultures that we've been raised in. And at that point, adults are expected to, care for their children and look out for them and, take care of the future needs, anticipate the future needs of their children. And so naturally, we have brains that are optimized for that.
That frontal cortex is only finished at 2021, which is, of course, when we see that goal focus coming online.
That's right. That's right. It's there earlier, but the connections are constantly being fine-tuned and tweaked. And I think that, and it's a longer period of time than most species. And, coincidentally, the prefrontal cortex is very, very large in humans compared to many non-primate species. So those connections are taking a long time to develop. And the prefrontal cortex, its functions depend on those connections. It's really about modulating activity in other areas based on our goals. Now, the functioning of the prefrontal cortex starts to decline in old age, but that's also the age at which people are less likely to have children. And it's an age where people are more likely in traditional cultures to be not so much about forming new memories as much as sharing the knowledge and the wisdom that they've already acquired. And so I think it kind of makes sense that you're less, it's all about me and more about the bigger group that you're in and being able to pass on those traditions to a large group. Now, of course, this is all speculative and kind of flaky, but I think it's just weird to think that somehow our brains have one period of time where it's functioning perfectly, and then the rest of the time it's just off.
Mm.
But
No,
I think the rigidity and the curiosity, it's often more related to the psychology of it. I think often people feel like memorizing should be easy, learning should be easy. And when we struggle, it's almost a sign of weakness or a sign that we can't do something, right? And what our theories of curiosity are all about is this idea that curiosity is based on the drive to get information. But if you don't believe you can get that information, you're going to squash that curiosity. And if anything, you devolve into anxiety, right?
Mm-mm.
And so I really get passionate about this idea that kids should be taught from an early age that learning is difficult and you can find the answer, but it's not about the answer, it's about the chase of the answer. And that we shouldn't be expecting kids to just master everything. We should be incentivizing them to struggle
Mm.
and to really find that information that they need to learn. And I think that's why, for me, I really found science to be so valuable because nobody was telling me what to do. I just did it.
Wow, that really does tell an important story about the power of that curiosity and that desire to get to the end of that long, mysterious route of the unknown. Now, I've got to insert a quick question here, as the listeners keep asking me to cover it, and I still haven't found anyone who knows as much about it as you. Deja vu. What's the current research on what's happening here? Because I understand they have actually looked into it.
Yeah, there's actually some really cool research. So, the original work on the neural mechanisms of deja vu goes back into, I think it was Hewlings Jackson described patients with epilepsy, and he did some of the early work to really characterize epilepsy. And a good chunk of these patients would have this intense period of deja vu right before they would have a seizure. So something was happening in the brain that would give them the sense that they're experiencing something that they've experienced before. But it was utterly artificial because it was being driven by this random electrical activity in the brain. So in the 50s, Wilder Penfield, this neurosurgeon, would electrically stimulate areas of the brain in order to remove the parts of the brain that were causing seizures. And when he stimulated parts of the temporal lobes of the brain in the areas around the hippocampus, and in particular in this area called the perirhinal cortex, what he would find is that people would get this intense sense of deja vu and feel like they're in a place that they've been to before, or feel like they've experienced this exact event before. So fast forward a little bit later, and researchers, including myself, were finding that the perirhinal cortex was important for the phenomenon of familiarity. That the more familiar people were, even with like a particular word, like, for most people, the word apple is very familiar compared to the word like rambutan, which is a very obscure word. And you don't even have to think about it to know whether or not you've heard the term rambutan before because it's just so novel. You wouldn't even think about it, right? You just know it's something that you've never had before. So where I'm going with this is to say that there's this brain region, the perirhinal cortex, that seems to be important for giving us that sense of familiarity. And when that area is artificially activated in animals, an animal will act as if something that is truly novel is very familiar. And so now Anne Cleary's done some fantastic research where she's created these virtual reality environments. And she can actually induce the feeling of deja vu in these environments. So imagine you're walking around a museum, right? And that's all built in virtual reality. So then people can walk into a video arcade, and that's built in virtual reality. But in the virtual reality engine, the layout of these spaces is exactly the same, except where there's a statue in one environment, there's a video game machine in the other environment. And when you see these stimuli, you would never, ever think that it's the same place. But people have the sense of deja vu. And the deja vu seems to be something about this high sense of familiarity, but where you failed to trigger an episodic memory. And so as a result, you just have this intense sense of familiarity. It's very much like you see somebody at a place that, you haven't been to before, but you see somebody and you're like, I know I've met this person before. I absolutely know it. And so you have this intense familiarity, but the context is so off that you don't realize that he works in the supermarket that you go to every week. And so, being out of that context, that sense of familiarity just gives you the sense of having a memory that's not really there.
Mm. Well, thanks, Charan. It's something so many listeners have been asking for a show on, and it'd be very, very interesting. I might have to get in touch with this lady. What's her name again?
Anne Cleary.
Anne Cleary. Okay, well, listeners, I'll do my best on that front. It's definitely something we should look into. Okay, thank you so much for this, Sharon, because it's so easy to follow the way you describe things. Now, another important component you describe in the book is the social and environmental component, which is particularly interesting to me as we've been covering collective intelligence and the way knowledge is sort of spread across cultures and generations in a way that's far less arbitrary than some sort of simple nature or nurture duality. And you draw on this fascinating example, the orca or killer whale, as it's also known. And you speak about this intergenerational memory transmitted from the elders via play. I was going to say that it's very much present in all mammals, the way of learning through play. By the way, I'm looking for the right guest to do a show on that, listeners or Sharon. If we can think of anyone who's studied learning and play, I'm really
Daphne Bevelier.
Daphne Bevelier, right? Well, there you go. Charan's sorted me out. But if anybody else has any recommendations, I'm always up for hearing the listeners as well. Thank you, Charan. I'll get onto that right away. On the other hand, you also draw attention to the remarkable variation in the orca's culture depending on the different habitats that they've learned to survive in. Tell us what these incredibly intelligent and flexible creatures can teach us about the social and intergenerational component of memory.
Well, what's fascinating is orcas are one of a smaller number of species. I think elephants fall into this category too, as well as humans, where the lifespan goes far beyond the reproductive years, right? And so if you have an animal that is, whose brains are evolved to, or who's, that's evolved to live past their reproductive years, it's an obvious question as to why. And I think the interesting idea that I was playing with is that maybe the function of surviving into old age is to be able to pass on culture. And you can see this in humans and you can see this in orcas. And, traditionally the leaders of human societies for a long time, you could argue now maybe it's gone a little bit too far. But traditional societies, the elders would be leading the tribes, let's say. And the elders were the ones who would pass on the traditions, the cultural knowledge, the language, the history, the medicine, the food foraging techniques, and so forth. And orcas have many similar characteristics. They have, a different pot of orcas will have different foraging techniques. They'll choose different kinds of prey to go after. They'll have a unique language and so forth. And the orca pods are led by females that are past menopause. So I think it's not a coincidence that our brains kind of shift gears from being sort of self-focused to being more culturally focused as we reach that age. It's about caring for our kin more than it is about ourselves. Um, but this idea of memory as taking on this collective sort of role, I think is a very powerful one because it's so involved in our development of our sense of self, of who we are. It's so involved in our, cultural ties. It's so involved in our, constant life story that we have. So, like, one of the things they talk about in the book is the idea that the act of remembering can change a memory. And every time I tell the same story about an event, I'm now imbuing that memory with traces of the last time I remembered it, right? So, analyses of language suggest that a huge proportion of our time just speaking with each other is storytelling. And when you're telling a story, what are you doing? You're sharing a memory. So, when I share a memory to you, my memory changes just from the virtue of having to figure out the parts of the memory that are worth communicating to you in some way. Now you give me your impression from that, and that changes my memory too. And now it's no longer my memory or your memory, it's our memory. You have a memory for something that you've never even experienced because I told it to you. And so this is how collective memories tend to work. And there's all sorts of cool research in child development to suggest that children's sense of who they are can be remarkably shaped by mothers' interactions with them about memory. And so, if a mother is very kind of encouraging of the child to elaborate on their experiences, they can develop a much more confident sense of who they are. And they can incorporate that into their life stories. And a mother who's very disparaging and dismissive of their child's memory, those people are more likely to have mental illness and low self esteem as they get older. So, these effects can be very powerful and they can go continuously throughout the lifespan, right? I mean, I talk in the book about the story of how I had a near-death experience on a paddleboard, and once I started telling the story to friends and students and so forth, it became kind of funny, and I think that's the power of collective memory and sharing memories is that we can transform our experiences from things that might be terrible sometimes to sort of life lessons and chapters in our stories.
Mm. Okay. So before we look back to the point on mental health, depression, ADHD, and trauma, which of course are related to these social and environmental factors as much as curiosity, motivation, attention, we touched on earlier, I first just want to set the scene by talking about the factors which contribute to a healthy memory. And oppositely, those which, of course, lead to memory dysfunction, particularly the famous ones, Alzheimer's, dementia. Now, unsurprisingly, it's the usual champions that win the day, right? Exercise, sleep, diet, social connection, caring for others. Can you just dwell on a few of these lifestyle factors quickly? Talk about why they work and perhaps explain why they seem to be so much better for prevention rather than just relying on medication with all its side effects when the decline is already well underway by then.
Well, we don't know for sure the answers to a lot of these questions, but a lot of the best interventions probably are multifactorial. But just as a broad strokes point, I like to say that basically anything that helps your mental and your physical health is going to be good for your brain health and good for memory and improve your resilience to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So one big factor is, for instance, with exercise, you improve circulation, you enhance the release of neurotrophic factors that can protect your brain. You can get a reduction in inflammation in the brain. So there's many factors. There's also a story that exercise can enhance neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the creation of new neurons. And, if you had to pick one, probably the vascular effects, super important. Being able to deliver blood to the brain is very important because the brain uses a lot of energy, right? And so, and when we have hardening of the arteries, that's inflammation, basically, right? So that's something that is going to be bad for brain health. And in fact, many people get demented not because of Alzheimer's, but because of vascular dementia. They have so many tiny strokes over time that effectively they become demented because they look like their brains have had Alzheimer's. But not just that, you actually also are at high risk for Alzheimer's.
And
Diabetes.
looking, yeah, I was going to say, looking on. We'll come back to diabetes in just a moment regarding inflammation, but just you also mentioned the importance of looking after your vision and your hearing, and
Yeah.
even shockingly, oral hygiene.
Mhm.
Talk to us a little bit about those three.
Well, so we don't, so much of this is stuff we don't know and we're just finding out about. But the oral hygiene, for instance, right? So gum disease, it's a disease. It's going to be associated with inflammation, right? And we tend to think of dental health as different from other parts of our body, but that's just silly. It's part of our body, right? We're learning now that long COVID has massive effects on cognition. And much before that, we knew things like multiple sclerosis, an autoimmune condition, or even things like chronic fatigue syndrome, again, autoimmune. But we all know the kind of brain fog you get even when you get the flu. It's not just a matter of feeling tired. You're not thinking clearly. Your memory gets bad. And so all of these conditions seem to be associated with an activation of the immune system. Now, sensory deficits are another factor. So, hearing problems are a big risk factor for Alzheimer's, and we don't know why. Untreated vision problems like cataracts can also be a factor. What we think is that maybe a big part of it is it reduces your ability to function socially and disconnects you from your social world. And one of the biggest things when people look at superagers, so these are people who in their 80s, their memory is pretty much the same as it was in their 50s. So they've really preserved their brain health. The two things that pop out the most is they're physically active and they're socially engaged.
Mm.
They have strong relationships. It doesn't mean they're necessarily partying all the time, although many of them are very extroverted, but they're really tied in with the fabric of society and they have a sense of purpose. And that social part, I will say we don't understand it very well. There's not a clear neuroscience story there,
Mm.
but it's one of the most important factors. And it may be related to things like neuromodulators, like dopamine, for instance. And those neuromodulators, the activity does go down with time, but you still have it. And so, for instance, when we look at things like curiosity, for instance, older people, when they are curious, will benefit as much from curiosity and learning as younger people do. So it's those factors again that may be at play that, when we're have a sensory disconnection from the external world, we're less likely to actively engage with the external world, and that's going to affect our cognition and our memory.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sharon. So I just want to move on. I wanted to go into a little bit more detail here, but I don't want to keep you too long, Sharon. I really want to get on to the mental health stuff. So I just want to move on to that now. You've talked about how depression isn't good for memory. And is that because one of the main symptoms of depression is the lack of motivation? I mean, is this turning back to the curiosity question that we touched on earlier, because you're not motivated to go out and find out new stuff? Is it a motivation question?
It is partly a motivation question. And it's partly we know that for whatever reason, the prefrontal cortex tends to be shut down in people with depression. And that may be from the chronic stress too that happens, or the anxiety that accompanies depression. We know also that depression in and of itself changes the way we remember. So when you are in a deeply negative mood state and you're feeling particularly bad about yourself, that mental context makes it easier to remember things that are very negative. And not just that, but it makes the things that we remember seem more negative. We reconstruct those memories with a negative bias so that we remember the same events more negatively. So, what's really important about that is you tend to ruminate about things that have happened that are negative events, either memories that are associated with people who've let you down or, things that are shameful, things that we regret, and you ruminate on them. And what happens is that you feel worse. And when you
Oh,
feel worse, you have more of a negative memory bias.
so we're
And
not
so
talking about memory function here. We're talking about the negative impact of that feedback loop on the memory process, not
that's
necessarily.
exactly
Okay, right. Sorry, because I
That's exactly right. But that's also then shutting down your motivational systems to explore. And it's reducing your tendency to do active learning. It's also having an impact on us socially that we're less engaged with other people, which has an effect on our memory. And so there's just a myriad number of factors going on. The stress that we experience, we have sleep problems. We haven't even gotten into sleep, but sleep is associated strongly with memory. And the chronic stress that you experience is very bad for the brain and it's bad for memory. So there's so many factors that come into play and they all are connected and interact with each other.
One of the big problems here we have is screen time as well, right? So screen time and multitasking is being shown to reduce memory, right? Attention, again, is this an attention question? Just too much distraction?
It probably is an attention issue. One of the things Gloria Mark has done some studies kind of in the wild, and her work suggests that people's attention span, the ability to hold attention onto one task, has gone down over time. But more importantly, we cultivate bad habits. Like as soon as I got my iPhone, any moment that I would be bored, I would pull out my phone, right? And so just having a phone nearby makes me more likely to have a little motivational urge to check email because I'm trying to avoid disaster with, missing emails and so forth. And so that motivational drive sort of tugs at me and reduces my ability to stay focused on this thing that I want to do. It's even worse when you have alerts on your phone and alerts on your watch, which are literally distracting you. And the thing is that every time that I get distracted, and when we do this to ourselves by multitasking, we really are doing that because we're not doing two things at the same time. We're switching back and forth between things. And that active task switching actually requires some prefrontal function just to get caught up. So when I go and I check a text message, I have to load up the instructions for what I'm supposed to be doing and load up that goal. Well, then I get back into this conversation and I have to remind myself of where we left off, and I have to use some cognitive control for that. And so what happens is that I'm behind schedule because because I have to get back on track every time I switch to this conversation.
Mm.
But also, we've created event boundaries every time I switch. And that leads us to have these more fragmented memories. I'm less likely to kind of really think deeply about what we're talking about. And so I get more blurry memories. And so I think this is a big part of why multitasking is so bad. And you can see this. Another example I like to give is photography and video use with phones. So we often go on a holiday and you just kind of use your phone to take a video of everything. And people think you're going to be more likely to remember it better if you take that video. But what happens is if you just do that, it actually takes you away from the experience and you're less likely to have a memory for a distinctive event that's going to stick out from all these other things. Likewise, you go to a concert and you just spend your time filming the concert, and what happens is it's actually taking you away from what you want to remember because you don't necessarily want to remember the song. I mean, you can always hear the song. You want to remember your feeling of being there and hearing the song, but also connecting with the artist and connecting with the people around you. And so it's super important that when people use devices, they use devices in a way that connects you with the experience as opposed to disconnecting you. That you take a picture not because you want to just mindlessly document it, but you try to use it to focus you on what's unique about this moment and to plant a cue in your mind that you can use later on to retrieve the memory. Or you take a video at the concert, not of everything, but of some particular moment that particularly is going to move you. And you want to be able to use that as an anchor for your memories later on.
Mm. No, Sharon, as I said, just the last area I want to get your opinion on because it's so important to the listeners of this show is trauma. Now,
Mhm.
memory is highly relevant to trauma, as on the one hand, memory of a trauma is often suppressed out of the episodic memory to help the person cope in the present. But on the other hand, because any attempt to retrieve that memory risks re-traumatizing the person again. But that leads us in a conundrum. How do we integrate those traumas to then move forward in a sort of healthy, with a healthier reaction to the cues and the triggers, which inevitably are going to arise in our present experiences, regardless of whether we remember the original trauma or not? And there's several approaches that we've covered here on the show for how we do that. There's EMDR therapy, clinically proven to radically reduce PTSD symptoms in the present by reframing the perspective of the memory. Secondly, Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, which works through bodily symptoms that have become coping mechanisms for the original suppressed memory. And I'm sure you could tell us of others, Charan. But my question here is about reframing a memory. If we go back to the first ideas in the interview, you spoke about how an experience is formed in an inside out way. Presumably, the brain has a huge potential for flexibility in reframing a memory. Tell us how this plays out and what the research is telling us.
Well, when we have an experience that's arousing and emotionally intense, like a trauma, what happens is the brain's releasing all these neuromodulators like noradrenaline that will promote plasticity. But what's interesting is part of that memory that's formed is the sort of the threat response that comes up, for instance, during a traumatic event, like a near-death experience, like you get into a car accident or something. And so your body, your brain is sort of revving up your body to try to cope with this trauma and to deal with it somehow. And so what happens when we remember a traumatic event is often it's accompanied by that bodily response, the visceral feeling of remembering. Now, what's interesting is that the brain systems involved in generating those visceral feelings are not quite the same as the ones that are important for remembering the context and actually remembering details. So sometimes when people can remember details of events, but it won't feel as vivid as when they have that intense visceral feeling of remembering. And that's when people will say, I have a vivid memory. Even if they don't have any more detail, it's that physical feeling of re experiencing it that comes into play. So and things like cognitive behavior therapy, there's two parts of it that are very important. One part is dealing with that visceral sense, and that is the behavior therapy part. And another is the part that you mentioned, which is reframing these experiences, which is the cognitive part. So the old school idea of therapy is, the truth will set you free. And I think like Freud had some quotes, something like, the art of like therapies or psychoanalysis is to convert like intense trauma into everyday misery or something like that. I'm probably
Yeah.
misquoting it, but it's something along those lines. But being aware and processing something isn't necessarily going to make it go away. As you point out, you can re-traumatize people. And part of the cycle of post-traumatic stress disorder is, in fact, recurring memories of these traumas in different contexts that lead the memory to become more and more generalized to more and more places and situations, which make it then come out more and more. So, what's important is to be able to look at the experience differently. That's a big part of it. So, we often tend to think of memories as objective records of the past, but they're very perspective dependent and they're very rooted in interpretation. And the same memory that can be associated with shame can be thought of as a story of courage and survival. It can be thought of as a learning experience sometimes. And so these are things that we can get through sharing memories with other people. So I used to do group therapy during my clinical training. And one of the biggest things that I learned was, I used to think group therapy is just watered down individual therapy because I'm trying to do therapy to 10 people. And it's totally not like that, because if you share a traumatic memory with a group, someone else can look at your story and reflect it back to you from a different perspective. And now you can incorporate this different perspective into your memory. But what happens in groups is people often put in their story into the mix. And it's kind of like as one person puts in their story, another puts in their story, you get this new narrative that's not about any one person and it's not a story that's all about you. And you can take these different perspectives and incorporate them into something that, again, is reframed from being a story of shame and guilt or threat to one of courage and survival and, so forth. And so I think
And they're,
that's a big part of it.
and they're very different emotions, aren't they? So we're reassociating emotions. It's not about what happened. It's about the emotions that come up for us in association with it.
That's
Now,
right.
another extraordinary new approach to reframing is becoming apparent in the psychedelic research too, where the symptoms of treatment-resistant conditions like PTSD and depression are being radically altered by the integration of adverse memories in these completely altered states. So, for example, in DMT research, the active ingredient in ayahuasca and other indigenous medicines, we find this mysterious phenomena of remembering an experience from the point of view of another person present. The presence of non-dual experiences, often called mystical experience, also seems to be coming out as significant in the results of the psychedelic research. And I've been playing with a hypothesis that this is due to the lowering of the activity in the DMN, in the default mode network, which is associated, as you mentioned earlier, with this kind of sort of quotidian sensory information. What do you know about what's happening in the brain in the reframing of memories during psychedelic experiences, Charan? I mean, what the hell do we do with a phenomenon like that, that you literally re-experience it from the point of a view of another person in the room?
Well, we're still in the phase of even figuring out how effective these things are. It's hard to tell the hype from the real results, but the initial results are very impressive. And I think there's one thing that we've learned about psychedelics is they massively enhance plasticity. And they also, as you pointed out, you beautifully said it, in fact, that you view these experiences during a psychedelic state from a dramatically altered perspective. So you have plasticity that's just massively opened up, and you viewing these things from a different perspective. Now you have the opportunity to have traumatic memories that are viewed from a distance and experienced in a very different way, while your brain is so plastic that you can dramatically revise the way the memory is processed. And so, just to give you an idea, one of the principles in learning theory is called extinction learning. So, for instance, if you are phobic of, bugs or something like that, you can become exposed to bugs and your brain learns to suppress the fear response. There's another phenomenon called reconsolidation, where if you enhance plasticity when a memory is retrieved, like a fear memory, like you encounter a bug while you're open, where you have this period of high plasticity, you can actually learn to erase the memory, not just learn to suppress it, but you can erase it altogether. And so that reconsolidation may be what's happening during psychedelic experiences is you're retrieving, traumatic memories, experiencing them in very different ways, and then rewriting the book, so to speak, so that now the memory is disconnected from those initial responses that you had.
Wow. Well, Charan, thank you so much for giving us that little bit of extra time. It was so, so important for me to get in this little component on trauma. So, listeners, you must go out and get, there was so much we didn't manage to get to today. You must go out and get Charan's book. It's at the top of all of the reader lists at the moment. We're very, very privileged to have spoken to him today. Why We Remember. And Charan, it just leaves me to thank you on behalf of the listeners for a fascinating insight and a lot of fun at the same time.
Thank you, Freddie. This has been great.